Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to cover variables in Unreal Engine, how to create them, when they're used, and some of the most common things you're going to be doing with them. And I'll also be covering some of the most common variable types. This is all in preparation for the next video where we're going to finally start implementing some new custom logic into the project.
There are multiple ways to create variables inside of Unreal Engine. The first and most obvious way to create a variable is to go over to the Variables panel and click the Add Variable button here. It'll create a new variable. You can give it a name. And then over here in the Details panel, while the variable is selected, you can choose its type. And you can see that there are a lot of variable types inside of Unreal Engine, but you're going to get 90% of what you want from 10% of the variables here, which are going to be these variable types at the very top and your object variable types here. Now, an object variable type is a reference to a certain type of or object. One example would be inside of a blueprint where you need to access some values from the third-person character blueprint. One example would be an animation blueprint where you need some sort of information from the player character. One thing you could do is you could create a variable type that's an object variable for the blueprint's third-person character object class, and then you could access any variables inside of this class, and for the sake of example, we could get the value of sensitivity. So the object variables are just references to other blueprints so that you can pull data about them, and I'll be covering them in more detail in a future video on communication between blueprints, because there are good ways to communicate between blueprints and there are bad ways. And which way is the best way depends on which situation you're in. But that is a topic for another video. So, we have our main variable types here, and these are what I'm going to cover in this video. So, a variable is really just a way of storing information. At its base, it's just a collection of bytes, ones and zeros. It's given a type so that the computer knows how to read those ones and zeros. A Boolean, for example, on a basic level is just a 0 or a 1, an on or an off. A byte just uses 8 bits to represent a number between 0 and 255. An integer uses more bits to allow for the storage of a huge variety of whole numbers that are not, so they cannot be fractional. So you're either, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth, and you can also do negatives. Then you have an integer 64, which uses twice as many bytes to give you a range that's much larger. A float, which allows you to store numbers that are fractional, that can have a decimal point. Name, string, and text are 3 variables with slight differences that we'll cover in a future video at some point, but whatever you plan to plug the variable into, whichever nodes, if they're using a name, a string, or text, that's the kind of variable you essentially would want to use. Then you have a vector, which we've already done a little bit of work with, and a vector will simply, is in the simplest terms, 3 floats. One for the x direction, one for the y direction, and one for the z direction. We can visualize the vector if we click on any of our components over here and look at the details panel. This location is a vector, and there are 3 floats for x, y, and z. We then have a rotator, which is very much the same, except it's storing rotational values in degrees. And finally, we have a transform, which is an interesting one. A transform is this whole assortment here. It holds location, a vector, rotation, a rotator, and scale, another vector, inside of a single variable. Now let's make this variable a transform. We can compile it. And before I show you some things that we can do with variables, I want to cover some of the other options here. We have this instance editable, and if we tick that, it'll show us this eyeball, this opened eye here. We can also click the eye to make it to make a variable instance editable. If we compile, go back into our level and click on our character, we can access our transform variable under this default panel, this default tab. Because it is instance editable, we can edit its default value on an actor by actor basis. So we could set the location for the variable to be 50 on the X. We can copy and paste this, and we can give it a different value, 10. And the default values for the transform variable for each of these are different. Blueprint read only determines whether or not you can set or change the value of the variable inside of a blueprint graph. Tooltip allows you to write a tooltip. If I just type in something and I drag out my variable and I want to get the variable's value, and if I compile and hover over, usually it should display the tooltip in this box here. But that doesn't seem to be happening right now, and I'm not sure why. But also, if you hover over a variable, you might see this little button here that says toggle comment bubble. You can click that and you can add a comment to the variable. Then you just type anything in there, and that will just stay above the variable, so it's another way of keeping notes inside of blueprints. And on that note, you can also create a comment around any group of nodes by highlighting them, pressing C, and you can type something in. It's a great way of keeping your blueprints organized. So every variable is going to have a pin that you can drag off from, and it has and this line we're dragging around has a type, and it's only going to connect to variables to inputs of a like type. Transform is not compatible with float is what it's telling us here, because we're trying to plug in this orange transform value into this green space that is only supposed to accept floats. Now there are some cases where you can convert between variable types, such as floats and integers. You can convert an integer to a float, or you could take a float, round it up or down, and make that an integer. But then if you release once you've dragged the line out from a variable, we have some options for different things we can do. And these are context sensitive, which means these are only things that we can do with the variable type transform. Some basic ones that we'll be using with variables might be an add. But to really show those, I'm going to switch this type to float. I click change variable type, compile. So we can add. under math, you can see we have this float plus float, and we could connect two different floats together. We could connect another float to this, and then take the result. For any variable type dealing with numbers, you have all basic arithmetic, subtraction, multiplication, division. Now, we're working in Unreal Engine 4, but in Unreal Engine 5, it will, any node that is, that can support multiple different types of variables being plugged into it. Let's say there was a vector plus float, for example. Here we can add a float to a vector, and that's just going to add our float to each of the three floats stored inside of the vector value. In Unreal Engine 4, we have to get this node, but in Unreal Engine 5, it will give you your mathematical nodes in a way where you can just plug in any other variable type, and it'll work. It'll convert the node into that node of float plus vector, or float or vector minus float, or whatever you want, as long as it can be done. I just wanted to briefly touch on that because I know in the future, once Unreal Engine 5 is out, that a lot of you will probably be following along inside of that program. So that's the basic math we can do with a variable. If our variable was a type string, which is the most common type of variable when dealing with text, we could do, one cool thing you can do is append, and allows us to combine strings together. So I could just add, this is a string with the space after it, because it's not going to automatically put in a space. And I could actually also add a semicolon. And again, I'm going to compile so that this default value here updates. And then I could give it a default value of string. And I know this is a string. String doesn't really make much sense. But if we take this and we get an event tick, and this is an event type that fires off an execution every tick of the game, and we can get a node type print string. We can plug in our string, and remember we set this to string, and we did an append, so we're appending our variable onto this string of text. Now if we play, see on the side, every tick it's printing that string to the screen. And that's just something I wanted to show you guys while we're talking about variables and variable types, because it's super useful, especially when you're debugging. You'll find that you want to use print string quite often, because you're not just limited to strings. You can actually set the duration to 0 so that it doesn't show on the entire length of the screen, just in one spot. And we could take this yaw from our control rotation and plug that into inString, and it's going to convert that value type to a string. We can play, and it's going to give us our control rotation in the corner there. Well, yaw of our control rotation. But now let's imagine we're printing 10 strings and 10 different blueprints, and we're trying to debug an issue, so we've thrown in all these print string nodes, and it can get really confusing really fast. So what you can do is you could plug this into an append node. And I'm control clicking to move and control which pin this is plugged into. And now I can say control yaw, compile, play, and I forgot to actually plug this append node in. And now we've titled the string that we're printing to the screen each tick so that it's much easier to understand what we're looking at in a situation where we have a bunch of things being printed onto the screen all at once. So now I want to cover a variable type that is the boolean. And this is a 1 or 0, and on and off. Let's give it a name. Let's call it debug. And if you want to follow official Epic Games syntax, you can add a B before debug and use camel case, where we're capitalizing the first letter of each word, and it'll know because it's a boolean to not show that first B. This is how booleans are titled in code for Unreal Engine, so I like adding that B before them in my blueprints. And we can compile and set our default value to true. And now what we can do is we can get a node that is type branch. And this is your basic if-then statement or if-else statement inside of Unreal Engine. You can plug in a boolean into it as a condition, and if it's true, you can print a string. If it's false, we can not print the string. And now, because debug is enabled, we have our control yaw printing. But now, because we made this variable instance editable, I can uncheck debug, and when I play, we don't print our control yaw to the screen. And any sort of operation you can think of that might result in a true or false, you can pretty much do. There's a lot built into Unreal Engine, such as all of our, such as comparisons, like float greater than, or greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal, not equal. So you can. It was really here. I'm just trying to go over some of the most commonly used variable types and the nodes that I really commonly use with them in this video, and then in future videos we're going to be using these variable types to build out some new logic for our project. But I just wanted to cover briefly this first, give you guys an idea of what's going on here, of the sort of workflow we're going to be using. And I think that is pretty much it for this video.
I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you've stuck around this long, you've probably enjoyed the video, and I'm willing to bet that you'll enjoy others on the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we will implement a health system so that our character can take damage. And if there's time, maybe we'll implement a little turret or enemy to shoot something at our character too. I'll see you there.